So should I just start talking then?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So the question was two parts. How will Greenland and other Arctic areas be affected by climate change, and how will native populations in those areas be affected as a result of climate change, especially given that their kind of lifestyle and their culture is so adapted to the specific climate conditions that have existed in the Arctic for so long. I paraphrase that correctly, I hope, right? That's kind of what you're after. So the science of climate change basically shows that while the global temperature rise over the last 100 years or so has been about 1.3 degrees Celsius, that climate change, that temperature rise is going to be felt more, I guess the magnitude of the temperature rise is going to be higher in the Arctic regions, especially in above about 60 to 65 degrees north latitude in the northern hemisphere. So the areas including most of Greenland, the northern part of Canada, the northern part of Alaska, and also in Europe and Asia and Russia. The northernmost reaches are going to be more affected. That is, the temperature rise in those areas is more than the global average. And that has a lot of effects. For example, the Arctic sea ice that generally melts a little bit, it retreats a little bit every summer and refreezes every winter. The extent of the Arctic sea ice melt is much, much greater today than it was 40 years ago, say. And estimates range from by 2020 to 2040, somewhere in the next decade to 3 decades, the Arctic sea ice will completely melt over the summer. And that has a tremendous impact on ecosystems in the Arctic region, the animals that depend on ice, the animals that depend on transportation over ice in this area, and also the people, obviously, that are part of those broader landscapes and ecosystems. And so, I could go into much more detail on the science of why the Arctic regions are affected, because a lot of what's happening is it's kind of this perverse effect that as more Arctic sea ice melts, that actually causes the climate in the polar regions to warm even more rapidly, because when there's ice, the ice reflects sunlight, and as we know from class, if solar rays are reflected, the reflected rays are not absorbed into the atmosphere. They do not warm the atmosphere. But if the ice melts and the dark color of the water compared to the lighter color of the ice absorbs more of the rays, when then the water releases that as thermal energy, that energy does heat up the atmosphere. And so it becomes what's called a positive feedback loop that actually further speeds up the warming trend in the polar regions based on this larger extent of ice melt in the summer months. And I could go on about the science, but I don't want to bore you with the science of why the Arctic regions feel the effects of climate change more directly and more on a larger scale. It's going to affect indigenous populations in the same way. In the same way that climate change around the world affects everyone. We have had a relatively stable climate for the last 10,000 years. We've become very, very good at living in that stable climate. And now we're changing it really, really quickly. The problem is the change that we feel in the mid-latitudes is less than the change that we feel in the Arctic and Antarctic latitudes, what we call the high latitudes, the upper latitudes. And also those people that live there live much more closely connected to their natural environment. That is, they're directly dependent in a lot of cases on hunting, on small-scale agriculture. In those kinds of things, there's a lot less that can be done to mitigate the problems of climate change between the climate changing and the humans existing in that place. For example, I worked at a research lab several years ago, and one of the other researchers at that lab, she was working at a field site on the north slope of Alaska, in Barrow, Alaska, one of the most northern places in the United States, way above the Arctic Circle. And she was interviewing village elders to try to understand how cultural memory could tell us something about climate change. And she said that the village elders related that for their entire history that they could remember going back many generations, they never needed refrigeration because they could simply dig a hole in the ground, and even though during the summer the few inches at the surface melted, if you dug deep enough, just a couple feet down, it stayed frozen all summer long. And so you could put meat, you could put all kinds of perishable items, food items, in, and that essentially serves as refrigeration all summer long. He said that's no longer the case. They now have to buy refrigerators. They now have to make sure to have electricity for the summer months for refrigeration. And so very immediate things in the day-to-day are changing, and this is going to drive populations to have to migrate. This is going to drive populations to have to change lifestyle, to change diet, and then obviously cultures change as a result of those kind of ecological and environmental changes.